played here. As you can see, I'm kind of in a new area. I'm actually recording in my living room. I have a new camera. I think that this space will make the audio a little bit better. I've always had problems with the audio. I'm not a professional when it comes to video and audio stuff, so hopefully this is a little bit of an improvement. Please let me know in the comments what you think, if it's better or worse. Today I'm going to talk about the things that drive me absolutely crazy about translating Chinese web novels. There are a few things which make it very, very difficult, and I'll just jump right into it. First of all is the fact that Chinese does not have capital letters. I mean, obviously. In contrast, in English, we use capital letters to indicate things like proper nouns and just basically important stuff within the text that we're writing, but that doesn't exist in Chinese. It's really up to the translator to decide what to capitalize and what not. In the past, I've had a lot of problems with this kind of thing. When I first started translating, I capitalized virtually everything that was a new concept, from like spirit stones to cultivation. I capitalized at the very beginning. Back in those days, anything that came across as new or interesting to me, I sort of capitalized it. Nowadays, I've sort of swung to the other side of the pendulum and I capitalize almost nothing. Maybe I've gone a bit too far in that sense, and I'll probably kind of go back and forth a little bit before reaching a perfect equilibrium. A good example is that there is a term chosen that comes up in the novels that I translate. And this term basically means like chosen or doted upon by the heavens. It's a noun that's used to describe a certain like group of people who are basically special compared to the other people. When I first started translating web novels way back in the day, I capitalized chosen. I did that through the entire translation of I Shall Sail the Heavens. And my current project, which is A Will Eternal, I continued that practice up to the point where I finally realized that it's an extremely common term within these xianxia novels. It comes up all the time for, people can use it to describe basically just people they think are awesome. Sometimes it's actually an official sort of like title. So I've stopped capitalizing it, and I have it as just a regular lowercase noun because it's a common noun in my opinion. Anyway, the point is that the fact that there are no capital letters in Chinese and we have to figure out what is a capital, what should be capitalized and what not, tends to be like very frustrating. Another thing is that there are very few formal rules about punctuation in Chinese. I think if you look at ancient texts, there basically is no pronunciation. In the xianxia novels, you often have jade slips, which are based on bamboo slips, and bamboo slip is basically just a slip of bamboo that would then be bound together to form a scroll. And if you look at those scrolls, the ancient scrolls, there basically isn't really any punctuation. Sometimes they'll have the big period at the end of major thoughts or paragraphs. In the novels that I translate, the author tends to basically use commas to be either commas, semicolons, colons, or periods. He ends the paragraphs with a period, but within a big paragraph, it will just be comma, 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 comma. And some of those commas could be periods or other punctuation marks you don't really know. It's up to the translator to parse and then decide which specific punctuation marks to use. Sometimes it comes very intuitively. Obviously, as I've gained more experience in translating, it's become easier. But sometimes there will be several clauses separated by commas in Chinese that really should be sentences in English, and sometimes it's hard to decide which part goes with which other part. Occasionally it's simply confusing, but at other times it will completely change the meaning of what it is that you're trying to express. And so sometimes I'm sitting there for like minutes and minutes trying to decide which section this part is supposed to go with, the part before it or the part after it. Oftentimes I ask my wife for help with this. She's Chinese. She reads a lot, and incidentally, when she was in college, she scored top in her entire class in Mandarin, both in terms of the spoken and the written. So she's like has very good Mandarin, but even she sometimes has trouble deciding which part of the sentence this section goes with. So that sometimes just really frustrates me. I'm spending minutes and minutes, and I know minutes doesn't sound very much, but when you're talking about spending minutes on one sentence within an entire chapter of hundreds of sentences, it really can make things go longer and longer and longer and make my day very frustrating. So the next thing that's super frustrating is that there are no plural nouns in Chinese. Okay, let me step back a second. There is a way to sort of express the fact that a certain noun is plural, but it's not necessarily standardized or common. A lot of times it's used when addressing people. Like for example, the word 朋友 means friend, and it's pretty common to say 朋友们, which means the plural of friends. And there are other words that are more commonly made plural, and occasionally you will see situations where not commonly pluralized nouns are made plural by adding that mun character to the end of it. But basically you don't really need to do that, and a lot of the times it's perfectly fine to just use the noun by itself within a sentence to mean a plural, but there's no way to tell even from the context. This really drives me crazy. A perfect example is there's a sort of a title in the translation I Shall Sail the Heavens. The title is Tao Child, and it's basically referring to somebody within this sect of immortal cultivators who has a very high ranking and is very powerful within their sort of cultivation level. Thing is that early on in the translation, within the first couple hundred chapters, that term often came up in this context. In Chinese, it would literally say something like this. It would say, and bear in mind, there is no word the in Chinese that makes it easy to determine whether you're talking about a singular, like proper noun, or a group of people. It would just say, this sect's Tao child or Tao children were very powerful. There was no way to tell whether it was Tao child or Tao children. And when I was in those first early dozens and hundreds of chapters, I was very confused about whether that meant there was one Tao child per sect or whether there was a group of Tao children in the sect. This kind of stuff came up a lot throughout the entire translation. A conscientious translator will read ahead and will eventually understand those things before reaching those points within the translation. And over the years, I've learned to deal with this situation a lot better than in the past, but it's still very frustrating to come across a portion of text where you're not sure whether it's talking about one person or whether it's talking about a group of people. The final most frustrating thing that I have to deal with, and this is like 100 times more frustrating than all of those other things put together. Seriously, it's like sometimes I just want to like run and jump out of the nearest window, and that is typos. So when the Chinese authors are writing the stuff, they make mistakes. The easiest way to type Chinese, and the way that most people type Chinese that I'm aware of, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but the easiest way is the pinyin method, which basically means that the authors type in the letters which correspond to the sound of whatever Chinese character it is, and then the character will pop up and they can enter that text. There are other input methods, but I think this is the one that most authors use, or at least the one that the author that I translate the most uses. And the problem is that obviously you can make typos just as you can in English. And then what will happen is the wrong Chinese character will come up. Sometimes it will be a situation where, for example, the sound of the character will be the same, but it'll be a different character. Other times it'll be the author actually typed in the wrong thing. Maybe they left out a letter or added the wrong letter, and then the wrong character comes up. They don't notice. It's actually very easy to make typos in Chinese. When I'm typing in Chinese, whether it's on my phone or on the keyboard, I make mistakes constantly. So I fully understand why it happens. But for me, it's extremely difficult to identify those typos. Sometimes it'll just be a straight up typo. I'll hit it in my translation, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking like, what is this? And I pull up the dictionary, and then I copy the text and I paste it into a search engine, and I look up other dictionaries and other methods. And then finally I'll be like, I don't understand, and I'll take the text and show it to my wife, and she'll be like, oh, it's a typo, it means this. And so I just spent 15 or 20 minutes researching something that turned out to be just a mistake. And then sometimes the opposite happens, where I'm trying to, like, I think something is a typo, and I'm trying to figure out what does it really mean. Like I'm like come across something like, okay, this is obviously a typo. What other characters would make sense in this situation, that I spend 15 or 20 minutes trying to figure it out, and finally I get so frustrated, and then I go to my wife and say, what does this mean? And she'll be like, oh, that's an idiom, it means this. And it turns out it wasn't a typo after all, it was just I didn't understand this particular phrase. And so this issue of the typos, it kind of goes in both ways, whether it's a typo that confuses me, or whether it's a situation where I don't realize it's a typo, or sometimes it's in between where I'm kind of struggling to decide which is it. Is it a typo? Is it real? Should I spend the time to should I spend the time to look up the character and research it to try to figure out if it's a phrase I don't know, or should I just directly go ask my wife, is this a typo? And then she makes fun of me if I'm wrong or something. So anyway, those are the things that I find absolutely most frustrating about translating Chinese web novels. I hope that this gives you a little bit of an insight into the things that translators have to deal with. Of course, my set of frustrating things is going to be different from other people's, especially considering that a lot of the translators are actually native speakers of Chinese, at least either full native speakers, or maybe they're ethnically Chinese, raised in the United States, so that they kind of have both languages as sort of a native language. But for me, I started learning Chinese as a second language and spent, roughly 10 years trying to learn it and master it. And here I am as a native English speaker with Chinese as my second language. And that leads to a whole host of problems that sometimes really do drive me crazy. All right, that's it for this video. I'll see you next time.